Last September, I made a video called How to Recognize Chord Progressions by Ear, but I talked about the phases of the moon. A lot of people clicked off because they wanted tips, not a practice system, but I couldn't identify anything that
wasn't a flat 7.
Now I can identify most chords by ear and I have tips. Learning this is worth more than just playing songs without looking up the chords. Learning these chords made me a better songwriter because I knew what I wanted to put. If I hadn't learned, I would have missed out on knowing that
the 3-chord sounds awesome.
I understand music so much more now. Not only do I know what music theory stuff is, but I also know what some of it sounds like. It also made me less terrible at telling scale degrees. I'm still awful, but slightly less. I will refer to the chords as most people do, in the order of the notes in a key. A D minor chord in C major would be called a 2 chord because D is the second note in C major. An A minor chord in the context of G major would sound the same and also be called a 2 chord because it's also the second note in G major. For example, you'd hear a 5 chord and think the lowest note of that chord is 5 notes up or 4 notes down from the first note of the scale. You have to listen for the lowest note, not just the movement of the whole chord, because the movement is misleading. It's easy to hear the lowest note of the chord in music with a lot of bass. The bass most likely plays the note the chord is named after. Even though I'm utterly clueless about identifying notes in a key, I could identify the note the bass is playing. I had to know more than 0% of the chords though to have a clue of what chord it was, but if you're 100% new at identifying chords or notes in a scale, it may be better to start learning in other ways. Everyone says if you hear a 5 chord, you always want to hear a 1 chord. I haven't always found that to be the case. Sometimes I want to hear a 4 chord and then a 1 chord, like in the blues music. Whenever I wanted to hear that, I thought, is this a 5 chord? And it helped me learn. I tested whether a chord was a 2 chord by asking myself if I wanted to hear the 4 chord. When I hear a 2 chord, I usually want to hear a 4 chord. I had learned how the 4 chord sounds before. You could try figuring out what chords you usually want to hear next and using that as a clue, but it could be different than mine. This is the way most people think when they learn to know chord progressions by ear. My descriptions of how I experience the chords may not work because others may experience them differently, but they could help a little, or you could find a description that feel right for you. But don't rely on it until you remember the sound because it could apply to other chords and mislead you. No word can describe an abstract sound exactly.
Tension
Measures how badly you want to hear another note of chord when you hear the current chord. The second method specifically has to do with which chord you want to hear next, and this method is based on measuring how badly you want to hear it. I had an impression from the other videos I watched about ear training that the only way to identify the chords is by measuring the amount of tension. I found that way to be ineffective when I was starting out, besides identifying the 1 chord and the 5 chord, because I felt the other chords had the same amount of tension, which didn't really feel tense, but didn't really feel resolved either. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people experience this differently and found looking for tension more helpful, especially since the 2 and 4 chords are called subdominants because a bunch of music scholars agreed they have more tension than the rest of the chords, but not as much tension as the 5. If listening for tension works for you, I won't yuck your yum, but I found other ways. Also, the way they described 5 chords made it seem like you would faint from the amount of tension they have, but to me, it wasn't that much, especially not compared to how they described it. It's like barely there. It's like, oh yeah, I can barely hear it. Yeah. a little bit. Especially when it's played directly after the root chord, which happens frequently. I had to listen very closely. The way I did was to imagine if the song just ended there and ask the question, would I be comfortable with the current chord playing? If you are looking for tension, compare it to one chord. After knowing every chord sound except for 2 and 6 chords, I tried looking for tension. Being more experienced helped me pick apart a slight difference in the amount. When I heard minor chords that I knew weren't 3 chords
because they didn't sound awesome enough,
I thought they are either a 2 chord or a 6. The 2 chord sounds less resolved than the 6 chord to me, and I was more familiar with the 6 chord. So I asked myself, if I heard a chord that I 100% knew was a 6 chord, would it sound more resolved or the same? After you learn one way, you can learn to think of the chords the other way, which can be easier because you already know what the chords are as a guide. Oh, and this is a 6 chord. It's this much from the root chord, but it sounds like a shy, somber sunset too. You have to combine these tools to feel like a detective when you're learning what the chord sounds like. Does it yada yada yada? That could be a 2 chord. Does it make me want to hear a 4 chord then? Does it sound like this song that already has a 2 chord? Once you remember how they sound, you recognize them without trying. It'll be more like it's recognizing you. It'll tickle your brain and then you'll instantly react,
oh, 5 chord,
like in a split second. And then you'll even be able to figure out the chords that don't play for a whole bar
because it will recognize you again.
The optimal order of learning chord progressions is as follows. First, you need to know what the 1 chord feels like before anything else, because that's how you orient yourself in the key. It's the chord that you're most okay with the song ending on. Telling the 4 and 5 apart is one of the most critical steps because those chords are really common. 5 chords sound more different to the tonic compared to 4 chords. 4 chords sound like the root chord went higher up and didn't be resolved anymore. Then 6 chords. Once you know 1, 5, 4, and 6, it's, those 4 chords. And most songs have just those chords and you'll be able to tell those songs. Compare the minor chords with each other. It's a subtle difference, but you'll hear it clearly enough with enough exposure. Some people may be thinking, you're only talking about major. What about minor? But the strangest thing happened when I tried to learn the chords in minor. Minor is just the same thing as major, but they play the 6th note much more. So it makes you hear every note compared to the 6th note instead of the 1st, which is why minor scales start on the 6th note. The major scale that you would play 6 notes up is called the relative major. So I was listening to a minor song, and then suddenly my brain was like, 4! As if we were playing golf. But we're in a minor key. And I looked it up, and it was actually the flat 6, which would be a 4 chord if we were in relative major. Okay, so if that's what my brain will do, I can pretend that it's major. The flat 7 chord in A minor would feel like the 5 chord in C major because they are both G. And it worked. And so I used the same numbers as in major. And it could work for you too. You can also use the same numbers for other modes. For example, Dorian's root chord is the same as the 2 chord in major. So you could say
do
whenever you hear a root chord in Dorian, and for that whoa chord, Pink Floyd chord, you call it a 5. If this works for you, you don't have to train your ears separately for each mode. And training your ear in one mode will help you in another mode. When I had trouble telling the 2 and 6 apart, I listened to Dorian songs to figure out where the 2 chord was relative to other chords. Even if different chords randomly started sounding like a root, and your brain switches back between the relative major and minor, your brain, or at least my brain, will not get disoriented and still call this a 6 even if it's resolved, because that's what it is in comparison to all the other chords in the song. Some of them still sound weird but are natural in a key. Those are called inverted chords, and they sound funny because they're not as consonant as regular chords. When you hear an inversion, you must tell what scale degree is the lowest note and what the rest of the chord sounds like at the same time. While modern music has an easy way out of hearing the lowest note, bass. Listening to music with our phone speakers makes it hard to hear the bass note, but better speakers are available. Pop and rock are genres for practice because the bass is the most effortless to hear. So pop, we'll have to pop out. If you hear the 7th note of the scale in the bass, it's probably the 5 chord inverted, so that the 7th note of the scale is the lowest. If you play a chord progression and know what any number chord sounds like in one key, it'll sound the same in any key. The only reason why I even put the keys on the clock in the last video is that I used to have trouble with adapting to the sound of different key centers, so I could fix that. If I played at 3 and had the chance to play at 2, I could switch keys mid-practice and observe how my brain has struggled to adapt to the new key center. This would help me tell the chords of the song in a different key than the last one, instead of waiting until my brain adjusted. I just forgot to explain that in my old video. I hope I didn't make that many people be like, oh god, I have to learn all the keys individually, this is gonna take 87 years. You don't, it's okay. Don't worry about diminished chords. Oftentimes, 4 or 5 chords are not right before the 1 chord, so you need to learn how they sound in general, not just how they sound going back to the 1 chord. Learn only 1 or 2 chords at the same time. If you learn 2 simultaneously, make it chords that you can fuse together so you can learn how to tell them apart. Don't overwhelm yourself and have patience. A way to learn is by looking up a chord progression of a song on the website Hook Theory, and then listening to it and following along. Okay, that's a 4 chord. It's a 6 chord right there. Hook theory is very accurate. It also helps to play chord progressions on an instrument. Make sure to make the notes move as little as possible so you can isolate the relationships between the changed note. There is a difference even when it's minuscule. Don't give up. You can find it eventually. Play higher and lower versions of the chord progressions and have a lot of variety so your brain can find out what's in common with those. And what is in common is the pure chord sound. If you can identify one of the chords in a progression, don't stop using it for at least a month so you don't forget it. It's like me with Mixolydian music. After I listened to enough... Oh, I already said that in my chord of the day video. And it's funny, if you don't know a chord and don't want to guess, be careful not to be overconfident. Otherwise you'll train your ear wrong. Learning is also about learning what the transitions to each chord sound like as well. For example, it was easier for me to tell what a 2 chord was when it was after a 1 chord for a long time. You need to learn how chords sound after a lot of other chords. This is why minor is still hard for me to figure out, even though I know the relative major chords. I need to get more familiar with how chords sound like moving to and from the 6. So that's all I have learned. I talked about what helped me in this video because it might help you too. Because it brought me from being like, chords, I have no idea how they sound, to like, oh, that's a 3 chord, that's a 2 chord, except it wouldn't be that's a 3 chord, because like no one uses 3 chords, because they're lame. So, it might help. Have fun!